German pilots once scoffed at the American B-17, dismissing it as nothing more than a lumbering barn with wings. Yet the world would come to know it by a different name, the Flying Fortress. This was not merely an aircraft, it was a machine forged from industrial willpower, a vessel where armor, firepower, and sheer resilience transformed laughter into dread. No other bomber of the Second World War endured such relentless punishment, brought so many crews home, and altered the psychology of air combat across Europe. Imagine a plane riddled with more than 600 holes from cannon shells, still crossing the Channel and landing in England. German pilots who once joked now whispered that it could not be killed. Beginning with the great raids over Regensburg and Schweinfurt in the summer of 1943, when American formations struck the factories that kept the Nazi war economy alive, the B-17 revealed itself as both symbol and weapon. Its legend did more than devastate targets, it fueled morale across the United States, filling newsreels, inspiring films, and proving that industrial strength could outweigh tactical genius. The Flying Fortress was not elegant, nor was it subtle, but it embodied a new truth of modern war. In the skies above Europe, survival belonged to the machine that could endure. This is the story of the bomber that changed the balance of power. They did not expect it to last. To the Jagdwaffe of 1943, the American B-17 appeared less like an aircraft than a mistake. A flying warehouse stuffed with machine guns, ungainly in profile and surely fragile under fire. German pilots called it der fliegende Klotz, the flying block, from the canopy of their Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s. They anticipated an easy harvest. What they met instead, above Bavaria in August of that year, was the beginning of a transformation in aerial warfare. The raids on Regensburg and Schweinfurt were not ordinary sorties. They were conceived as precision daylight strikes at the sinews of the German war economy, the ball-bearing factories that allowed every tank tread and every aircraft propeller to turn. On the morning of the 17th of August, more than 300 B-17s of the 8th Air Force crossed the Channel, climbing into formations that glittered like steel fortresses suspended in the blue. Each machine carried 10 men, 13 Browning 50 caliber guns, and enough bombs to tear open the heart of a factory town. Yet the Luftwaffe counted on experience. They had been fighting since 1939, while the Americans were still novices. The clash came quickly. Waves of German fighters bored into the bomber boxes, attacking head-on. The classic method for overwhelming heavy bombers. 20mm cannon shells struck wings, tails, and fuselages. Dozens of flying fortresses exploded or spiraled down in fire. But then came the sight that unsettled veterans, aircraft with entire control surfaces missing. Engines ablasse, gunners dead at their posts, yet still holding formation, still flying toward their targets. The fortress, true to its name, endured what by all precedent should have been annihilation. To grasp the shock, one must consider psychology. German pilots were trained to expect fragility. They had grown accustomed to Spitfires disintegrating under a short burst, Soviet Yaks collapsing when coolant leaked. The fortress violated that expectation. Its structure was a paradox, an aircraft whose very mass made it harder to destroy. Reports circulated of B-17s surviving hits that would have shattered 3 ordinary fighters. In that moment, laughter gave way to unease. Economics deepened the lesson. Each fortress was not a singular marvel, but a unit in a larger arithmetic of production. Boeing's lines in Seattle and Douglas's plants in Long Beach produced hundreds each month. The American economy could replace losses faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy them. To German eyes, the bomber seemed less like a machine and more like a manifestation of an entire continent's industrial will. They could down 50 in a day. But 100 more would appear in the skies within weeks. As the formations withdrew that evening, the landscape below littered with wreckage. Both sides drew hard. Conclusion. The Americans lost 60 bombers, nearly 1 in 5, but struck their targets with precision. The Germans celebrated tactical victory, yet sensed strategic peril. For the first time, they confronted an enemy weapon that seemed to absorb fire without obeying the laws of destruction. The first encounter did not deliver triumph to the United States. It delivered something subtler, proof that the gamble of daylight bombing was not folly. A fortress could indeed survive a siege, even at 25,000 feet. In the weeks that followed, German pilots adjusted their language. No longer was the B-17 dismissed as a clumsy barn. It was, with a mix of respect and dread, Der fliegende Festung, the Flying Fortress. The title was an accident. Yet accidents in war often acquire destinies of their own. In July of 1935, when Boeing unveiled its new 4-engined bomber at an airfield in Seattle, a journalist for the Seattle Times gazed at the airframe bristling with multiple gun positions and wrote the phrase that would outlive him, the Flying Fortress. At the time, it was marketing more than prophecy. A clever headline for a prototype still labelled Model 299 by its designers. Yet in retrospect, the name condensed an entire philosophy, one that set American bomber doctrine apart from every other air arm in the world. The philosophy was simple in outline, but radical in implication. A fortress could defend itself. Instead of speed as protection, or manœuvre à survival, the Boeing engineers imagined overlapping arcs of machine gun fire covering nose, tail, waist, and dorsal approaches. The early prototypes carried less than a dozen Browning 50 caliber guns, but by the time the B-17 reached combat in Europe, the number rose to 13, creating a defensive geometry unlike any other. Every crewman except the pilot and co-pilot doubled as a gunner. Survival was not individual but collective, an airborne phalanx with steel instead of shields. For the United States Army Air Corps, later the Army Air Forces, the fortress label carried political weight. In the grim climate of the late 1930s, when isolationists resisted foreign entanglements, advocates argued that bombers like the B-17 could defend America by striking any enemy at its source. General Henry Hap Arnold and his colleagues believed that precision daylight bombing would cripple an enemy economy without the need for endless ground combat. Here the fortress metaphor acquired strategic dimension, not merely a defensive citadel, but an offensive bastion, projecting power thousands of miles from home soil. German observers, however, scoffed. To them, the silhouette of the new bomber, with its broad wings and greenhouse nose, looked ponderous. The Luftwaffe built its doctrine on the speed of twin-engined Ju-88s or the agility of Stukas diving steeply onto pinpoint targets. A fortress seemed laughable in the fluid arena of air war. One ace sneered in a pre-war briefing that the Americans had built a porcupine too heavy to climb and too slow to escape. What they missed was the underlying arithmetic. A porcupine requires only that its quills deter predators long enough to survive. And in mass formations, the B-17's quills multiplied exponentially. Industrial context reinforced the symbolism. In the United States, the production line itself became a fortress. By 1943, Boeing plants in Seattle, Douglas, facilities in Long Beach, and Lockheed Vega workshops in Burbank were turning out bombers at a rate the Reich could scarcely imagine. Each airframe represented not just metal and rivets, but an invisible army of machinists, welders, and riveters, many of them women newly entered into industrial labor. For them, Flying Fortress was not a boast but a description of their contribution. Every rivet a stone in the wall, every engine a tower. When the aircraft reached England in 1942, British airmen raised eyebrows at the grandiose title. They had flown Wellingtons and Lancasters by night, surviving through darkness rather than armour. But soon reports of fortresses limping home with tails shredded, engines gone, and fuselages riddled convinced even skeptics that the name carried truth. What had begun as a newspaper flourish became a psychological anchor for crews who climbed into aluminum shells day after day. To tell a 19-year-old waist gunner he was inside a flying fortress was to confer not only duty but belief. By the time the Regensburg raid unfolded, the name had migrated from propaganda to lived reality. Germans who once joked began writing in their after-action reports about Festungen in der Luft, fortresses in the air. The term had crossed the linguistic front line. A word coined in Seattle now resonated across Europe as both warning and acknowledgement. It was more than branding. It was identity. A myth hardened into steel. The summer of 1943 revealed the truth of doctrine in the most merciless classroom possible, the airspace above Bavaria. American commanders had promised that precision daylight bombing could strike at the marrow of German industry. The chosen targets were not glamorous cities, but the seemingly mundane factories of Regensburg and Schweinfurt, where ball bearings were produced in quantities that kept every tank tread and every aircraft propeller moving. Disrupt that flow, strategists believed, and the entire war machine might seize up. On the morning of the 17th of August, more than 300 B-17s lifted off from English bases. They formed vast aerial caravans. Rectangles of silver stretched across the sky. A geometry of industrial power made visible. Each aircraft carried 10 men, 5,000 pounds of bombs, and 13 Browning machine guns. The mathematics of destruction was clear. The bomb load aimed at crippling the Reich's machinery. The defensive guns aimed at survival long enough to release it. The Luftwaffe answered with fury. Entire Geschwader were scrambled, hundreds of Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s rising to carve into the bomber boxes. They attacked head-on. The most dangerous angle, but the one most likely to break the formation. 20mm shells exploded among the bombers. Flaming debris fell into fields below. In sheer losses. The day was catastrophic for the Americans. 60 bombers destroyed, hundreds of airmen killed or captured. Among crews, the date became synonymous with pain. A prelude to what many feared would be unsustainable attrition. Yet the raid also produced a paradox that confounded German pilots. Many fortresses that by all logic should have disintegrated refused to die. Aircraft with 2 engines gone continued level flight. Bombers missing sections of stabilizers still dropped their loads over Regensburg. One crew reported watching a neighboring fortress complete its bomb run, even as flames licked across its wings. What was supposed to be a massacre turned into an unsettling demonstration of endurance. Psychology played a role no less than physics. For American crews, survival depended on discipline within formation. Alone, a B-17 was meat for the guns. Together, their fields of fire interlocked into a moving fortress wall. For German attackers, accustomed to quick kills, the spectacle of pressing the trigger and seeing the target remain airborne created a new, corrosive doubt. Economically, the raid was ambiguous. The factories suffered heavy damage but resumed production within months. Strategically, however, the message was unmistakable. The United States was willing to pay terrible costs to hammer the Reich in daylight. Losses that would have paralyzed a smaller nation were absorbed, replenished by assembly lines in Seattle, Long Beach, and Burbank. For the Luftwaffe, the arithmetic was grim. Even a tactical victory could contain the seeds of strategic defeat if the opponent could endlessly replace men and machines. The climax of the day did not occur in the bombing run itself, but in the aftermath, across German airfields. Pilots compared notes with a mixture of pride and unease. They had downed dozens. Yes, but too many had escaped. Trailing smoke, yet unbroken. In English bases that evening, the mood was somber. Mess halls lined with empty chairs. But beneath the grief lay a recognition that the fortress concept, though bloody in execution, was viable. Thus the Regensburg and Schweinfurt missions became both tragedy and turning point. They taught the Americans that unescorted raids would bleed them white. But they also convinced the Germans that the B-17 was no ordinary adversary. What had been mocked as a flying barn had shown itself capable of enduring a siege in the sky. From this crucible emerged the conviction on both sides that the struggle over Europe's airspace would not be decided by a single duel of fighters, but by the capacity of fortresses, human and mechanical, to survive fire and return again. Tomorrow, numbers alone never flew a mission. Behind every silver airframe that crossed the channel were 10 men, sealed into a frigid shell of aluminum that the world celebrated as invincible, but that felt, from the inside, perilously fragile. A B-17 carried 13 Browning machine guns, but each one demanded a human hand, a human eye, a human nerve that would hold steady as tracers stitched the sky. The fortress was both a machine of steel and a community of flesh. The cockpit was the realm of the pilot and co-pilot, men often no older than 22, burdened with responsibility for 9 lives. Below them in the nose crouched the bombardier, guiding the Norden bombsight with a mixture of faith and calculation, believing that the delicate gyros could transform altitude and velocity into a pinpoint strike on a factory roof. Behind him stood the navigator, eyes fixed on charts, stars, and the elusive landmarks beneath cloud. Along the fuselage, waist gunners braced against icy slipstreams, while the ball turret gunner curled into his rotating sphere, inverted to the earth. The loneliest position in aerial warfare, the tail gunner faced rearward, watching for predators, condemned to see the enemy's guns before anyone else. The conditions defied imagination. At 25,000 feet, the temperature fell to 40 degrees below zero. Frost coating oxygen masks, fingers stiffening on triggers. Without pressurization or insulation, crews fought not only the Luftwaffe but their own bodies. Frostbite claimed toes and fingers, hypoxia dulled senses. Each man wore heated suits, yet circuits often failed, leaving gunners to fire through numb hands. Survival training instructed crews that 10 seconds without oxygen meant unconsciousness. 60 seconds meant death. The fortress was both protector and tormentor, demanding endurance beyond ordinary limits. Psychologically, the strain was cumulative. The 8th Air Force calculated that 25 missions constituted a tour, yet statistics showed that the odds of completing such a tour in late 1943 were less than 1 in 3. Each morning, as crews gathered for briefing, a silence would fall when the map revealed deep penetrations into German territory. Veteran crews exchanged glances. Who among us will not return tonight? The fortress image, so powerful in propaganda, offered a fragile shield against fear. German pilots learned quickly that penetrating this human architecture was more difficult than they imagined. Attacks head-on met concentrated streams of fire from nose and top turrets. Strafing from the rear invited converging beams from tail, waist, and dorsal guns. No single gunner carried the defense. Survival depended on interlocking arcs of fire, each man trusting the other to cover his blind spot. In this sense, the fortress embodied a uniquely American conception of combat, not the lone ace, but the collective. The bomber box was an airborne society, cohesion its lifeblood. Economics and psychology intertwined. To train a fighter pilot took months. To train a 10-man bomber crew took years. For each role demanded specialized skills. Yet the American system produced thousands. sustained by a continental economy that could afford the cost. Inside the fortress, men knew they were part of an experiment in industrial warfare, individuals fused into a machine larger than themselves. For some, the knowledge was comforting. For others, suffocating. The climax of understanding came in those rare moments when the system held. Crews would watch a fortress beside them, shredded by cannon fire. See gunners slumped at their posts. And yet observe the machine hold course. The surviving men carrying on until bombs fell. In those instants, the metaphor of the fortress felt real. Stone walls do not flinch, even when bricks crumble. When the day's mission ended and the surviving aircraft wheeled back over English fields, ground crews counted bullet holes, patched aluminum, and replaced turrets. The men staggered out, exhausted, sometimes vomiting from nerves, sometimes laughing in manic relief. They had lived another day inside the fortress, a paradoxical home where fear and protection coexisted. For them, the flying fortress was not a newspaper phrase but a lived reality, a cold, deafening, steel-clad chamber where survival was always uncertain, and where the line between individual and machine blurred into one. War is often remembered through statistics. Yet what shaped morale on both sides were the exceptions, the machines that by every law of aeronautics should have perished but somehow limped home. The B-17 gained its reputation not from its design specifications but from these legends of survival. Stories passed from crew to crew, whispered in German intelligence reports, and splashed across American newspapers as proof that the flying fortress was more than propaganda. One of the earliest and most famous tales belonged to the Memphis Belle. In May of 1943, it became the first fortress to complete 25 missions, a full tour. It was not the best bomber, nor flown by the most decorated crew, but it embodied endurance, photographed and filmed for wartime audiences. The Belle represented possibility. If one could finish the gauntlet of daylight raids, others might too. Yet around the same time, less celebrated aircraft were returning in conditions that defied reason. There was the fortress that landed in England with its nose nearly severed, bombardier and navigator clinging to survival, while slipstream howled through the gap. Another limped home with one engine functioning. The others feathered, its fuselage peppered with more than 500 holes. Crews told of machines with stabilizers gone, tails shredded, hydraulics bleeding fluid, like lifeblood. Yet the aircraft remained airborne. The most extraordinary cases involved fortresses that returned with dead pilots, co-pilots dragging wrecks down onto English fields, or with gunners frozen at their posts, bodies locked into the silhouette of defiance. German pilots could not comprehend it. Their 20mm shells had reduced Spitfires and Yaks to splinters in seconds. They fired entire magazines into fortresses, only to watch them stagger westward, smoke trailing like banners of defiance. Intelligence officers at first dismissed such reports as exaggerations, but physical evidence on crash-landed bombers confirmed the reality. Here was a machine built not for elegance but for persistence, capable of absorbing destruction in volumes unprecedented in aviation. From a psychological perspective, these returns mattered more than operational reports. For American crews, seeing a crippled bomber wheel into the landing pattern, engines coughing, tail half gone, it was an injection of faith. If they could survive that, perhaps we can survive today. For German pilots, the same sight inverted morale. What do you do when your weapons no longer guarantee death, when every successful attack may still leave the enemy flying? Such doubts gnawed at confidence, eroding the tactical dominance the Luftwaffe once took for granted. Economics again reinforced the message. Each miraculous return was not just an anecdote, but a practical saving of manpower. 10 men rescued from capture or death meant 10 trained specialists available for tomorrow's raid. Multiply that across dozens of such survivals. And the effect on operational continuity was immense. The fortress did not merely save aluminum, it preserved the irreplaceable human capital of the 8th Air Force. The climax of this chapter in the fortress legend came with aircraft so battered that they became icons in themselves. Photographs circulated of bombers with entire vertical fins shot away, with wings held by a single spar, with fuselages torn open yet patched back to fly again. These images reached American audiences through newsreels, fueling a mythology that resonated far beyond airfields. Civilians bought war bonds, believing that the fortress was invincible. Young men enlisted inspired by the thought that they would serve inside armor that could defeat fate. By late 1943, German intelligence assessments conceded what once had been laughed off. The flying fortress was not easily destroyed. It could be downed in numbers. Yes, but individual aircraft could endure punishment that broke the logic of air combat. The impossible returns were more than stories. They were evidence that modern war had entered a new phase, where survival was engineered into the structure, and where psychology itself became a weapon. The fortress did not promise immortality. What it offered was something subtler, the chance, against all odds, to come back. And that chance was enough to alter the balance of belief in the skies over Europe. History remembers the 14th of October 1943 as Black Thursday, a day when the promise of the flying fortress was tested in the most merciless fashion. On that morning, 291 B-17s lifted from English fields, bound once more for Schweinfurt, the heart of German ball-bearing production. It was the second attempt in 3 months to cripple the machinery of the Reich at its hinges. The plan relied on the fortress concept tight formations, overlapping arcs of 13 heavy guns per plane, yet without adequate long-range escort. The crews faced the Luftwaffe alone. The statistics are brutal. 60 bombers never returned. More than 600 airmen were killed or captured in a single day. Loss rates approached 1 in 5, an attrition that no force could sustain for long. Across American bases that evening, mess halls were lined with empty chairs, the absence of familiar voices echoing more than any gunfire. For the 8th Air Force, Black Thursday was both tragedy and revelation. The flying fortress could survive astonishing damage, but not indefinitely, and certainly not without help. From the German perspective, the day looked like vindication. Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s slashed into the bomber stream in waves. Coordinated attacks from nose, flank, and tail. Cannon shells ripped through formations. Parachutes blossomed against the cold autumn sky. Aircrew reports exulted in the harvest. Jede ohne mit victory. Dautzlinge. Many fortresses, torn and burning, continued westward. Their bombs already dropped. German factories suffered damage despite the slaughter. The Reich's economy bent but did not break, while its fighter force expended fuel and pilots in battles that had to be repeated again and again. The psychological dimension was complex. For American crews, Black Thursday seared itself into memory not as defeat but as a rite of passage. Survivors spoke of watching entire squadrons erased, yet still pressing on to the target because turning back meant death alone. The fortress mentality, mutual dependence, refusal to break formation was reinforced by catastrophe. Men who returned did so with eyes hollow, voices strained, but also with a conviction that their sacrifice carried meaning. For Germans, the day offered a fleeting sense of mastery, but also the creeping recognition that American industry could replace machines and men at a pace they could never match. Economically, the mission was ambiguous. Schweinfurt's factories were damaged. Output reduced by nearly 1/3 for months. But production rebounded. Strategically, however, The raid forced a reckoning in Washington and London. The cost of unescorted daylight raids was unsustainable. If the fortress was to fulfill its promise, it required a partner, the long-range fighter that could clear the skies. Thus Black Thursday, though a disaster in immediate terms, prepared the ground for the marriage of the B-17 with the P-51 Mustang, a union that would eventually strip the Luftwaffe of its last illusions of dominance. The climax of the day was not only the destruction but the endurance. Stories circulated of fortresses returning with engines gone, wings shredded, fuselages torn apart, yet still landing in English fields. Ground crews counted bullet holes until they lost patience. For the public, those tales became legend, softening the horror of losses with the reassurance of invincibility. For historians, they revealed a paradox. The flying fortress was both too fragile to survive unescorted and too resilient to dismiss. In the end, Black Thursday marked the pivot between myth and strategy. The fortress idea had been proven, but its limitations laid bare. It was not a miracle machine that could win the war alone. It was, rather, a cornerstone in a larger edifice of industrial power, one that required fighters, logistics, and relentless production to realize its potential. On that October day, amid the smoke and shattered formations, the world glimpsed both the strengths and the vulnerabilities of the flying fortress. It had endured the siege, but at a cost that demanded a new chapter in the air war over Europe. Black Thursday had delivered a verdict. The fortress could not hold the sky alone, even with 13 heavy guns. Even with crews disciplined into boxes of steel and fire, the attrition rate was unbearable. American commanders faced a choice: abandon the doctrine of daylight precision or find a way to stretch the shield of escort fighters deep into Germany. The answer arrived not in theory but in metal, the North American P-51 Mustang. The Mustang had existed before Schweinfurt, but its true potential was unlocked only when fitted with the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Suddenly, the aircraft could climb and cruise at altitudes where the B-17 lumbered, and more importantly, it could travel the full distance to Berlin and back. For the 8th Air Force, this was a revelation. For Luftwaffe pilots, it was the beginning of despair. By early 1944, the bomber streams that once seemed vulnerable now bristled with sleek escorts weaving above and alongside. Pilots of the fortress spoke of the moment when, after hours of tense flight over enemy territory, glints of silver swept past Mustangs, fuel tanks jettisoned, diving into German formations. "Chuoi, $P-51. One gunner remembered exclaiming, a line repeated in countless memoirs. Relief came not from statistics but from sight, friendly fighters tearing into the attackers before they could press their runs. The psychological balance shifted almost overnight. German tactics, once built around concentrated frontal assaults, crumbled when Mustangs prowled the flanks and tails. Luftwaffe commanders tried to mass their fighters regardless. But the new dynamic forced them into a two-front struggle: fight the escorts and the bombers simultaneously. Losses among German pilots, already mounting, accelerated to catastrophic levels. The fortress, once besieged, now had its own mobile cavalry. Economically, the effect was decisive. With escorts, the fortress could strike targets deeper inside the Reich with fewer losses. Aircraft factories in Leipzig, ball-bearing works in Schweinfurt again, oil refineries in Ploiești, all now within reach of sustained daylight bombardment. Every mission drained the German economy not just in destroyed infrastructure but in irreplaceable pilots. By mid-1944, average flight time for a new Luftwaffe recruit before combat was less than 100 hours. American bomber crews, by contrast, arrived with training quadruple that, The climax of this new partnership came in March 1944, when fortresses escorted by Mustangs bombed Berlin itself in daylight. For the first time, the Nazi capital experienced what London had endured in reverse: high-altitude destruction, raining without pause. Hermann Göring, once boastful that no enemy bomber would ever cross the German frontier in daylight, now conceded in private that the Reich faced annihilation from the air. For American crews, the arrival of the Mustang transformed morale. Survival odds improved. But more than that, a new sense of inevitability settled in. They were no longer outmatched novices climbing into certain death. They were participants in a system that fused bomber mass, escort agility, and industrial production into a single machine of war. In retrospect, the marriage of the Fortress and the Mustang symbolized the larger truth of the conflict. No single weapon won the air war, but combinations of technology, economy, and human endurance did, alone. The B-17 had proven valorous but vulnerable. With the Mustang, it became the centerpiece of a strategy that stripped the Luftwaffe from the skies. By the spring of 1944, German pilots who once joked about flying barns now faced a nightmare trinity: the fortress that would not die, the escort that hunted relentlessly, and the factory system that produced both without pause. What had begun in mockery was ending in attrition. And in that arithmetic, the United States held every advantage. By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe had reached a point of desperation. The flying fortress, once derided as a cumbersome target, now penetrated German airspace almost daily, escorted by Mustangs whose range seemed endless. Factories burned. Fuel stocks dwindled. Morale sagged. In response, Luftwaffe commanders turned to extremity. Sturmgruppen, assault groups designed to smash the bomber boxes through brute force. The Sturmgruppen were built on a grim logic. Standard Messerschmitt 109s or Focke-Wulf 190s could slash at formations but often broke off after short bursts. Unwilling to linger under the dense fire of 13 heavy guns per fortress. By contrast, Sturmgruppen aircraft were modified for survival in a suicide-like role. They carried additional armor plate, Hövjekanon, and sometimes reinforced canopies. The intent was chillingly clear: press into the bomber stream at point-blank range. Fire until the fortress disintegrated. And if necessary, ram the target. Pilots were volunteers only in name. Some were veterans who still clung to a sense of duty. Others were younger men swept by rhetoric that demanded sacrifice for the fatherland. Training emphasized formation attacks, wedge-shaped assaults that mirrored the very geometry of the bomber boxes they sought to destroy. German records reveal that commanders instructed pilots to close within 100 meters before firing, even though that distance meant swimming in the crossfire of waist and tail gunners. The first major Sturmgruppen engagements occurred in late summer, when Focke-Wulf 190s of JG-3 and JG-300 hurled themselves against 8th Air Force streams. For a brief, terrifying moment, the tactic worked. Fortresses exploded mid-air. Entire squadron disrupted. Survivors described the horror of armored fighters boring in so close that they could see German faces behind goggles. Mouths set in grim determination. Waist gunners fired until barrels glowed red. The air thick with brass casings and cordite. Yet the tactic carried its own doom. To approach so close meant heavy casualties. Escorts pounced on Sturmgruppen before they reached firing range, shredding armoured fighters that, despite modifications, remained vulnerable. Those that pressed through were often annihilated by concentrated defensive fire. After each raid, German losses mounted to levels impossible to replace. The Luftwaffe was bleeding out its remaining veterans in a strategy that combined bravery with futility. The psychological dimension of these attacks was profound. For American crews, the sight of fighters coming in straight, refusing to break away, provoked both terror and fury. But as formations survived and missions continued, confidence hardened. If even such desperate measures could not break them, nothing could. For German pilots, the Sturmgruppen epitomized a war sliding toward catastrophe. Courage was demanded in ever greater doses, while resources shrank to nothing. Economically, the tactic revealed the paradox of German strategy. Sacrificing trained pilots and armored fighters to destroy a few bombers might yield short-term results. But American industry simply replaced losses. Factories in Seattle and Long Beach rolled out hundreds of new fortresses each month. Every fortress destroyed might cost 10 American lives. But every pilot lost cost Germany an irreplaceable investment of years. The climax of Sturmgruppen Desperation came in September of 1944, when waves of armored fighters struck bomber streams near Oschersleben. Dozens of fortresses were lost. Yet the cost to the attackers was catastrophic. More than half the assaulting fighters were destroyed. It was a Pyrrhic exchange that underscored the futility of Germany's position. In retrospect, Sturmgruppen represent the last gasp of Luftwaffe tactical ingenuity against the fortress system. They demonstrated that courage could still inflict damage, but also that courage without strategy becomes sacrifice. For the fortress crews, surviving such encounters confirmed a new conviction. They were not merely flying machines, but instruments of an industrial logic the Reich could not match. And for the Luftwaffe, Sturmgruppen symbolized the descent from dominance to desperation, a tragic epilogue to an air force that had once believed itself invincible. In war, symbols often matter as much as statistics. For the United States, that symbol took the form of a single B-17 christened Memphis Belle. In May of 1943, she became the first flying fortress to complete 25 missions with her crew intact, a milestone that instantly transformed a machine of aluminum and rivets into a legend of flesh and blood. The Belle was not the fastest or the most heavily armed bomber. Her record was not without damage on several occasions. She limped home, riddled with holes. Engines smoking. Gunners wounded. Yet what mattered was completion. 25 missions represented the official threshold of survival, the point at which a crew could rotate home. For many airmen in the 8th Air Force, the odds of reaching that number felt impossibly slim. That one bomber and her 10 men had done so proved that the fortress was not a myth but a vessel of deliverance. The War Department understood immediately. The Memphis Belle and her crew were withdrawn from combat and sent on a morale-building tour across the United States. They paraded down city streets, greeted by cheering crowds and brass bands. Newsreels showed smiling young men beside their battered aircraft, assuring mothers and fathers that their sons could survive the brutal skies of Europe. The image of the fortress shifted from a technical machine to a cultural icon. The British, accustomed to night raids and heavy losses, watched with respect as the Americans turned a single aircraft into propaganda that fueled a national narrative. What mattered was not merely the crew's endurance, but the framing, the fortress as a home away from home, the bond of 10 men stronger than steel, the promise that persistence could defeat attrition. Hollywood joined in, producing William Wyler's documentary The Memphis Belle, a story of a flying fortress, shown in theaters across America. It depicted real combat footage, bombs falling, flak bursting, fighters attacking, woven with moments of humor and camaraderie among the crew. For audiences, the line between war and cinema blurred. From a psychological perspective, the Belle provided what military sociologists call a survivability narrative. In a war where individual lifespans in combat could be measured in weeks, the knowledge that one crew had endured 25 missions created a horizon of hope. Airmen measured their own odds against that benchmark. If the Belle could make it, perhaps we can too. In barracks and mess halls, her name became shorthand for possibility. For the Germans, the legend was infuriating. Intelligence officers tracked reports of the Memphis Belle, dismissing her survival as statistical anomaly, yet they could not ignore the propaganda value. American newspapers framed the fortress not merely as a machine, but as proof that the Reich could be fought and beaten in daylight. If one bomber could survive, then fleets of hundreds might endure long enough to dismantle the German economy piece by piece. Economically, the tour of the Belle coincided with an escalation of production. By late 1943, American factories were producing more than 500 B-17s per month. The legend of a single aircraft thus meshed with the reality of industrial scale. Citizens who bought war bonds after seeing the Belle march through their town knew that thousands of fortresses were already on assembly lines. The symbol and the system reinforced each other. The climax of the Memphis Belle story was less her final mission than her transformation into myth. She bridged the gap between the battlefield and the home front, between the horror of Schweinfurt and the optimism of parades in Chicago. Her battered fuselage, streaked with flak scars, became a canvas on which a nation projected endurance, sacrifice, and eventual victory. In the broader narrative of the air war, the Belle did not win the skies alone. But as a legend, she carried a weight that statistics could not. She showed that the flying fortress was not just an engineering project or a tactical doctrine. It was a cultural weapon, capable of shaping belief. And belief, in war as in politics, often decides outcomes as surely as bombs. By the spring of 1945, the sky over Germany had fallen silent. Luftwaffe fields lay cratered, their hangars burnt out shells. Fuel shortage left aircraft idle, their wings frosting over with disuse. Yet the contrails still streaked overhead, not of Messerschmitts or Focke-Wulfs, but of American bomber streams that roamed the skies with near impunity. In that silence lay the measure of the B-17's legacy. The flying fortress entered war as an object of ridicule, its bulk compared to Barnes, and its concept dismissed as fantasy. It ended war as an institution, a weapon system that fused industrial mass with human endurance. In total, Boeing and its partners produced more than 12,000 B-17s. At peak output, assembly lines in Seattle, Long Beach, and Burbank delivered dozens each day, rolling from factory floors into the airfields of England. Each carried 10 men, 13 heavy guns, and the industrial confidence of a continent. Statistically, the numbers are staggering. The 8th Air Force alone dropped more than 600,000 tons of bombs, much of it delivered by fortresses. Crews flew hundreds of thousands of sorties. Losses were immense, over 4,000 B-17s destroyed in combat, but the replacement system never faltered. For every fortress lost, another soon filled the gap. The Germans could shoot them down, but they could not exhaust them. That arithmetic production against attrition was the decisive equation of the air war. Psychologically, the fortress reshaped air combat. For the men inside, survival rates improved once escorts arrived. But even before that, the knowledge that a machine could endure catastrophic damage offered a lifeline of belief. For German pilots, the same endurance eroded morale. A weapon that could not reliably be destroyed undermined confidence in victory. In memoirs written decades later, Luftwaffe veterans admitted that their laughter in 1943 had long since curdled into dread. Economically, the fortress epitomized the American way of war. Each aircraft required tens of thousands of parts, miles of wiring, tons of aluminum, and thousands of man-hours. Behind every sortie stood the factories of Detroit, the steel of Pittsburgh, the aluminum of Tennessee, the labour of women who riveted fuselages under the banners of Rosie the Riveter. The B-17 was not only an airplane, it was a flying extension of the American assembly line. Its armour was industrial capacity itself. Culturally, the legend endured. The Memphis Belle became a travelling symbol of survival, its story retold in William Wyler's wartime documentary, and later in Hollywood dramatizations. Veterans carried the memory of fortress missions for the rest of their lives, recalling both terror and camaraderie. The sound of 50 caliber guns firing in chorus, the smell of burnt cordite, the sight of friends lost in fireballs beside them. The name itself, Flying Fortress, entered language as shorthand for resilience, invoked in contexts far removed from aviation. The climax of its legacy came not in a single battle, but in the paradox it represented. Technically, the Fortress was not the most advanced bomber. Later aircraft, like the B-29, dwarfed it in range and payload. Tactically, it required escorts to survive deep raids. Yet strategically, it was irreplaceable in forging the attritional campaign that broke the Luftwaffe and hollowed out German industry. It stood at the intersection of bravery and production, of myth and machine. As a historian, one must see the B-17 not simply as an airplane but as a metaphor. It embodied the truth that modern war is won less by elegance of design than by the capacity to endure, replace, and return again tomorrow. The Fortress taught that survival could itself be a weapon, that resilience could shatter confidence as surely as bombs shatter factories. When German pilots first encountered it, they laughed. When the war ended, there were few left to laugh. In that silence, the Flying Fortress spoke most clearly. Industry had triumphed over tactics. Persistence had outlasted brilliance. And a nation that could build fortresses by the thousand had written its will across the skies of Europe. They called it a barn, a block, a joke. Yet when the war ended, the wreckage on German fields testified otherwise. The B-17 Flying Fortress had endured fire that should have torn it apart, had carried hundreds of thousands of bombs into the heart of the Reich, and had brought home crews who by every calculation should have perished. Its legacy was more than aluminum and rivets. It was the proof that endurance can outlast brilliance, that numbers backed by industry can wear down even the most seasoned of foes. 12,000 fortresses were built. 4,000 were lost. But the system that produced them never faltered. In that relentless arithmetic lay the downfall of the Luftwaffe. For the men inside, the fortress was both a prison of fear and a shield of hope. For those on the ground, it was the thunder that shattered factories and morale alike. And for history, it remains a paradox. Not the most advanced bomber, not the sleekest design, but the one that embodied resilience so completely that it changed the air war itself. When the laughter of German pilots faded into silence, the echo that remained was the steady drone of the Flying Fortress. It was the sound of an industrial nation writing its victory across the sky, one battered airframe, one returning crew, one unbroken formation at a time.